Hello, my name is Mr. Hong and I teach English 2, AP English Language and Composition, World Literature, and Senior Transitions. How do you cope with all the injustice and pain that is happening all over the world? And let me say this first of all, I have not experienced a lot of the pain and injustice in the world that other people have. But when I see things happen, I see injustice, and I see things happening in the world that should not be happening, things that I'm powerless to do anything about. How do I cope with that? Well, I understand, I think, at a very basic level, why all of this is happening in the world. And it's because of sin. When sin entered the world, it changed our nature and it corrupted all of creation. It wasn't just Adam and Eve that were affected by sin entering the world. It was all of creation. The book of Genesis calls it a curse. All of creation is cursed because of sin. And so bad things happen in this world. Storms and typhoons and evil people doing evil things because of the existence of sin in the world. And I guess I cope with it by knowing that someday it's all going to be healed. It's all going to be better. The book of Revelation in chapter 22, it talks about the curse being removed. But I guess I cope with it with the knowledge that God is not unaware of what's happening and God has a plan to make it all better. And it's not going to happen in a timetable that's going to be really satisfying to us, but it is going to happen. And I live my life in faith that he's going to fulfill that promise. What are the craziest things you have done to wake up a student during class? I mean, apart from just like whacking my stick on the desk in front of him, is that crazy? I've done this before, like during a video where when I swoosh my stick really fast, it makes that really whoosh sound like that. But when a kid's sleeping in the back row, like during a video or something like that, you can do that like 2 feet above their head and it's not dangerous at all, like behind them and above their head, but it like wakes them up and in their brain it was like this close to them. And so that's kind of fun. I don't know if it's crazy. Oh, one time I just like screamed really loud next to a student who was asleep. That was funny. Is that crazy? I don't know. It's more about entertaining myself when I wake up students than it is about waking them up, I guess. Why does God allow such sickness like cancer to exist? He wouldn't be taking anyone's free will away if he were to save someone from cancer. In Genesis chapter 1 or 2, I forget where he says this exactly, but he says he looked at everything he created and said, "It is very good." Now, it doesn't take a genius to look around at things like cancer and say that's not good. And so something happened between the time God said this is very good and today, and that was sin entering the world. So we're still living in this in-between time, and things like cancer do exist. Why does God allow such sickness like cancer to exist? It goes back to this whole question of free will. He allows cancer to exist because he had to allow Adam and Eve the freedom to choose to sin, and they chose to sin. And when they chose to sin, it cursed the world, and so disease, sickness, earthquakes, and storms, all of this kind of things exist because the world is cursed. In a sense, you're asking me to tell you what God's motives were when he made these decisions, and I can guess, but the Bible doesn't say these things. God created this universe and created humans in a way that would result in the largest number of them who genuinely love and worship him, loving and worshiping him and having fellowship with him. Do you miss the class of 2020? Because we miss you lots. Of course I miss you. I love you guys, and I feel gypped that we didn't get to spend that last quarter together. If I'd known that when we said goodbye on Sikihor Island at senior trip that was going to be the last time I was going to see a lot of you, I would have made more of an effort to say some things to all of you that I would have wanted to say in person. So, how do you describe being a third culture kid to someone who has no experience? Start with the definition. For one thing, a third culture kid is a person who has spent a significant amount of their formative years growing up in a country other than their passport culture. I really would recommend that if you know somebody who's a TCK and they don't know what a TCK is, that you do take the time to explain it to them. Maybe you can give them the link to buy or rent or borrow from the library the Third Culture Kid book, Growing Up Among Worlds by Ruth Van Recken and David Pollock. It's a research book, but it actually helps a lot of TCKs understand who they are and understand most especially that they're not alone. At what point should we stop trying to share the gospel with a person who really doesn't want to accept it? Every single person is going to be different when it comes to this. And you're just going to have to be the one to decide, have I asked too many times? Do I need to ask again? Are they just waiting for me to ask again and then they'll say yes? Or have I crossed a line and I need to let it rest for a while? But I want to encourage you that research has shown that it takes somewhere between 8 and 12 times that a person is invited to accept the gospel before they actually accept it. So that should actually encourage you, because if you share the gospel with somebody and they say no, they're not saying no to you, first of all. They're saying no to Christ. And that's not your responsibility to choose for them. Your responsibility as a Christian is to share the gospel, not to persuade people, not to convict them, not to argue them into the kingdom of heaven. Your job is very simple. Tell the gospel. Tell your own story. Once you've done that, you have fulfilled your responsibility, but maybe it's somebody that you really love or care about, and you want them to receive Christ. Well, you need to gauge whether you've said too much or whether you should wait a while. In my own life, I have usually been somewhere in the middle. Let's just say 10 times on average before somebody receives Christ. Sometimes I'm number 3 or number 7 or number 8. I might even be number 9. Every once in a while, I have the privilege of being the number 10 and the person receives Christ. I've rarely had the opportunity to be number 1, except with my own kids. You never know. You share the gospel with someone and they say no, but you may have taken them one step closer to receiving Christ, and they'll say yes to the next person, and you may never know that. But that's the way it works in God's family. God uses you to do your part, and as long as you faithfully do your part, God can keep working. Like if you think of the person who is least likely to ever receive Christ, you think of a person you think he is never going to become a Christian. She is never going to receive Christ. With God, all things are possible. To never stop praying for those people. Is water wet? How do you obey God's command like seen in Hebrews 11? In Hebrews 11, it's called the faith chapter, and it goes through all of these different people, Abraham and Noah, Moses and Samson and all these guys. By faith, Moses did this. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, all of these people did these things. And there are 2 verses in that chapter that are the key. One is, I think, verse 13 or 15, it's right around there, where it says, these people didn't receive, they died without seeing these promises fulfilled. And then again at the end, I think it's the last verse in chapter 11, where it says that again, all of these people lived their lives faithfully, even though they did not receive the answer to the promises that were made for them. And so the question is, how do you obey God's command like seen in Hebrews 11? Well, it means being faithful to God and being faithful to following His word and following His leading, maintaining a good relationship with Him, all of those things, being a Christian basically for us, even though things don't always go our way, even though we don't necessarily see the fulfillment of things that God has promised. God promised those things to Abraham and Moses, and they lived their lives without receiving the answers to those promises, but they remained faithful. We like things right here, right now. Like, you promised us, God, so where is it? And God does not work on our time scales, right? God thinks in terms of decades and generations and thousands of years. It was like 2,100 years from the time God promised Abraham that through his seed, Jesus, all nations on earth would be blessed. 2,100 years. And from Jesus until us today has only been about 2,000 years. We haven't even waited as long for the second coming as Abraham's descendants waited for the fulfillment of that promise that was made to Abraham. You know, the Bible records a lot of waiting, and we read through it quickly and sometimes forget about the long waits. You can read about Joseph being in prison in the book of Genesis in about 5 minutes, but he spent 12 years in prison. There's a lot of waiting in the Bible, and we forget sometimes about the times of waiting. We look at their lives and it seems like, Elijah, bam, 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 all these things happened. Ezekiel, bam, 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 all these things happened. But it wasn't like that. It was like, bam, 12 years, bam, 18 years. And so I think that we need to have that same attitude. God is faithful. And if you believe that God is faithful, then it doesn't matter when he fulfills those promises to you. Maybe God made some promises to you, and maybe you're banking on those promises, and you're fine to do that and to live in expectation of the fulfillment of those promises. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be fulfilled in the timing that you prefer. I could have never foreseen God bringing me to Faith Academy to teach, but I was 48 years old when I came to Faith Academy to teach. And before that was a lot of preparation, making me into the kind of leader who could be an effective teacher at Faith Academy. And that doesn't mean that everything I did before I came to Faith wasn't important. I mean, I was planning churches and preaching the gospel and training leaders and pastors and stuff. It was all good. But to bring me here and now was a lot of waiting. So that's my answer to that. How do you obey God's command? I would say, how do you live this kind of life the way they describe in Hebrews chapter 11? You trust in God's promises, you believe that he's faithful, and you wait. What's the best advice you can give for relationships while studying in high school or college? I think the best advice that I can give to Christians, I realize that not everybody's a Christian who's a student at Faith or who's listening to this, but the best advice I can give for relationships, whether they're romantic relationships or just friendships or even working relationships, is choose your inner circle carefully. I don't think that Christians should avoid friendships with sinners, with people who are living an ungodly lifestyle. Jesus was friends with a lot of different people who were very ungodly, but he chose his inner circle very carefully. He chose those 12 friends that would walk with him and be his inner circle. And his inner circle of the three, Peter, James, and John, he also chose very carefully. I would give that same advice to you. Be friends with whoever you want, but choose your inner circle wisely. That inner circle of friends should be people who are going to encourage you in your faith, or people who are not going to encourage you to live the kind of lifestyle that's going to damage your relationship with God. There are things that will hinder your relationship with God that are not necessarily sin. So, for example, if I showed up at a volleyball match, let's say I'm playing on a 4-on-4 volleyball tournament, and I show up wearing like a big leather jacket and blue jeans and rubber boots. Is that against the rules? No, but it's kind of stupid. It's going to hinder me from playing well. And so it is with life. There are things that you may do that are not necessarily sin, but will hinder you running the race marked out for you, that Christian race, that Christian path. So yeah, choose that inner circle well, including your romantic relationships, your boyfriends and girlfriends. If you're going to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend, be sure that that person is someone who's going to encourage you in your faith and not somebody who's going to entice you to compromise your faith. If you're a Christian, you should only have Christian boyfriends and girlfriends. I couldn't even imagine how many examples I could give you of a Christian young man or woman who ends up dating a non-Christian young man or woman and ends up, after a couple of years, not living a Christian life at all. Most of the time, if you end up hanging around with non-Christian friends, they're going to influence you to be a worse person rather than you influencing them to be a better person. That's my best advice I can give for relationships while studying. What are the hardships or struggles of being a missionary? Well, there are so many. I obviously can't name them all. The two that are probably the biggest for me are financial and family relationships. I am not part of a mission like a lot of people, like a mission that forces you to raise a certain amount of money before you come. I came to join a group of church planners in Baguio City as a young single. I was 23 when I first went to Baguio, and they said, get a couple $100 and come. So I got a couple $100, $300 a month, and I went to Baguio City, and it really was not enough. And I would often finish the month eating Skyflakes and Cheese Whiz because I just didn't have enough money to buy any other kind of food. The missionaries there invited me over for dinner fairly often, so I didn't like die of malnutrition or anything like that. Financially, it has sometimes been really great and sometimes really not great. Right now we're doing okay, but I can think of plenty of times when we have really struggled financially. And that's hard. As a husband, as a father, you want to provide for your family. And when you have to say no to your kids, when you have to say no to something that maybe your wife needs or wants or something like that for financial reasons, it's just kind of hard. Family relationships, I mentioned. I didn't really miss my family when I first went to the Philippines. I didn't miss my parents or my brother. We weren't particularly close, but like we all lived together like until I went off to college. But I didn't really miss them. They weren't, my family was not a place that I went to process life, to talk about, good things and bad and things like that. I had those conversations with my friends, not with my family. My wife, when she went to the Philippines as a young single missionary, missed her family terribly because they did fulfill that role in her life. So some missionaries miss their family, some really don't. But now I'm in this new category of life where when we go back to the Philippines, we will be leaving all 3 of our children in the United States. So as a parent, I can tell you that I miss my kids terribly when they're gone. And I thank the Lord that I'm a missionary at a time when we can chat online, we can video call, we can call anytime we want and talk to them. But still, that's one of the hardship. It's one of the struggles, is leaving our kids behind and knowing that if something did go wrong, if one of them had like a car accident or something like that, I'm 36 hours away from being able to be with them, and maybe even longer than that, depending on the circumstances. How were Gentiles saved before Jesus died on the cross? I don't know. I really don't know. There are theories about this. We can speculate, and the thing is, I'm okay to not know. I am very okay to live with some uncertainty in life. I have a high tolerance for ambiguity in life. I do not need to know all of the answers, and I think that's a very healthy way to live life, because God has never, ever promised that He would give us all the answers. God has told us enough for what we need to know, for us to have a relationship with Him, for us to be saved, and that's all He's going to tell us. In the book of Job, he spends the whole book asking God, why? Why, God? Why? Why is this happening? Why is this going on? Why is the world like this? And God never answers. But then Job crosses a line and he accuses God of being unfair. He accuses God of making a mistake, of doing things poorly. And so God shows up in the storm and He speaks to Job out of the storm and He says, Job, do you want to run the world? Do you think you're wiser than me? Do you think you're more powerful than me? Do you think you're smarter than me, Job? Do you want to run the world, or do you want to trust me to run the world? Do you want to run your own life, or do you want to trust me to run your life and take care of you and see that things go in a way that's beneficial for you? Job is humbled by this, and he says, I spoke without knowledge, and he repented. And at the end of the story, God restores a lot of things to Job, but if you notice, He never answers Job's question. Why? Why did this happen? Job never knows. Sometimes we have this feeling like, oh, when we get to heaven, we're going to know everything. I disagree. I see the character of God as, when you need to know something, you'll know it. I'll make sure that information is available to you. But if you don't need to know it, it's none of your business. At the end of the book of John, Jesus is talking to Peter about Peter's life and what He wants Peter to do and all of that. And Peter looks over at John. John's right over there, and he says, well, what about him? And Jesus says, it's none of your business. It's none of your business what goes on with John. I'm talking to you, Peter. I'm telling you what you need to know to live your life. That may not be satisfying to you. If you're a real black and white person and you're like, I need to know, you're in for a world of hurt. And if your need to know drives you away from God because He doesn't answer your question about somebody else, that's a foolish decision. But I do know this: God is a God of justice. He is good. He is righteous. He knows everything, and He loves and loved those people who never had an opportunity to hear the gospel. So what's going to happen to them? I don't know, but I trust God. I'm not saying that means that they're all going to be saved. Not at all. I don't know what's going to happen to them, but I trust God that he's going to do the right thing. What makes you smile? P.S. The class of 2015 loves Mr. Hong. I love you guys too. You know what makes me smile? When my students take the time to write to me or send me a message or even comment on an Instagram post or something stupid like that. It just always makes me happy to keep in touch with my students, to know how they're doing, to find out what's going on in their lives. I enjoy that. It always makes me smile. If God knows who will be part of his kingdom and who will not be, doesn't it make him sad when he's creating someone knowing that they won't even be with him? As a father, I can tell you that I would be sad. I feel like I have done a decent job of raising Jaden. I've tried my best. I've made some mistakes, but for the most part, I've pointed him in the right direction. If he moves in the wrong direction and starts making poor choices, I'm not going to feel responsible for that. I will warn him and I'll advise him and I'll try and talk him out of it. But in the end, that's going to be his choice. If he walks away from the Lord, that is his choice. If he walks into something else, it's his choice. And I'm not responsible for his choice. And ultimately, God is not responsible for our choices. He has given us free will. And it's our responsibility to choose or not choose, to follow or not follow. Does it make him sad? Yes, but God made this world and made humans in a way that the most people possible would have genuine love for God, genuine fellowship with God, and would genuinely worship God. God calls us to be faithful. God calls us to have faith in him, to trust him. And we do. We trust that he is who he says he is in the Bible, and that he's going to work things out in the way that he's chosen to work things out in the best way. Do you remember all your students? Honestly, I don't. I don't teach the freshmen. I have gone through periods where I taught no sophomores, half the sophomores. And then for juniors, I teach AP language, and that's usually only about 12 to 20 students. It's very possible that a student could get to their last semester at Faith Academy in high school, and I've never taught them before. And those students, either they came late to Faith or they just avoided my classes for whatever reason. I just never taught them until their last semester in high school. Those are the ones that I would tend to not remember very well. But even those students, sometimes they really stand out. Sometimes we have a lot of fun. Sometimes they'll come and ask for my advice for something, or I'm involved with them some other way from volleyball or MUN or something like that. Even those students that I only teach one semester, I still get to know a lot of those fairly well, and I would remember them quite well. But do I remember all of my students? No. I don't know if it's possible as a teacher to remember all your students, but if you want to be remembered, you need to stand out. I prefer you to stand out in good ways, but some of the students that I remember best are the students who stood out in bad ways, you know? Not in bad ways like, oh, I didn't like that student, like right up to the day before graduation. We don't know if they're gonna graduate, you know, and I'm working all semester to try and get them to turn in their work and to try to be motivated and try to, you know, step up and all of that. I remember those students. They're not bad people. They're just poor students for whatever reason. So how do you improve on your grammar when you hate reading and writing? Well, first of all, you wouldn't say, how do you improve on your grammar? You would just say, how do you improve your grammar? So there's your first lesson. So my first advice would be, if you hate reading and writing, you need to read and write, because the best way, the number one way to improve your grammar is to read and write. Another thing that I would say about that is that you hate reading and you hate writing because you're not good at it. If you were good at reading, you would like it, because people like what they're good at. For the most part, people who hate reading are people who aren't good readers. Yet, reading is a skill. And anything that's a skill is something that you need to learn how to do. And anything that's a skill is something that you can learn how to do better. And you learn how to do things better by doing them, by practicing, whether it's a sport or a job skill or reading and writing. More you read, the better you'll get at it. And the better you get at it, the more you'll like it. Is there a way to know God's identity without reading the Bible? To an extent. Well, I can look at the universe and I can say, this universe is awesome. And it's here. So the fact that it's here means that somebody must have put it here. Somebody must have created it, because my common sense tells me that if something exists, something made it. It also has great design, like great complexity in the universe. And so I can conclude that whoever made all this, first of all, he's powerful. I could look at the universe and say, he must really like beautiful things and made me to like the same things that he likes. I can say that the universe shows great design means that he had a design for it, which means that he had a plan, he had a purpose for creating. And he created me, because I'm part of creation. So if the creator of all of this created me, he must have had a plan to create me. He must have had a purpose for creating me. And if he had a plan and purpose for creating me, then he must, at some level, know me and care about me. But that's about as far as you can get. It's called general revelation, just looking at creation and knowing something about God. Do you sometimes feel responsible if a student you taught once walks into the wrong road? No, I actually don't feel guilty about that, because I'm not responsible for my students. I'm responsible to do my part, and that is, since we're talking about paths, my job is to show you the right path. If I do my job well, and I say, you should go this way, you should follow this path, and you should not follow that path. If a student follows that path anyway, why would I be responsible for that? We're all responsible for our own choices. Now, sometimes that student who takes the wrong path will write to me. They'll email me, sometimes years after they graduate. In fact, I got an email like this just a month or two ago. They didn't say it this way, but I had taken the wrong path. I've been on the wrong path for a couple of years, and I want to get back on the right path. How can I do that? I don't feel responsible that they took that right path, but I love that they wrote to me and asked my advice on how to get on the right path, and that they see me as a person who in their life tried to show them which was the better path. They at least remembered that I said that, and they remembered that there is a better way, and that they came back to me to ask how to get on the right path. So thank you all for submitting your questions. I enjoyed answering them. I want to invite you that if you have any further questions or need clarification or want some more information on anything that I said, feel free to email me. And so until then, take care, and I hope all this information was helpful.